On that note, Armin Falk is Professor of Economics at the University of Bonn and Director of the Bonn Econ Lab. He is also Director of the newly founded Center for Economics and Neuroscience. His research generally aims at increasing the explanatory power of economics by providing it with a more realistic psychological and biological foundation. And today he's going to talk about some exciting work on an international survey of preferences.
Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, thank you very much. With all these precedents, I'm not exactly sure what I should talk about first. Maybe just one or two quick comments to Jim. You said, in terms of complementarity, big five and economic references are typically not correlated, with one exception, which is agreeableness, which is highly correlated with social preferences. And that is not surprising after you look at the agreeableness questions, they essentially talk about social preferences. Other than that, in terms of explanatory power or correlational structures, big five and economic preferences are typically not related. So we should think of them as complements rather than substitutes. Today I'm talking about economic preferences, which doesn't mean that's all we care about. As Jim correctly said, there's some fundamental structure that informs why we look into things like risk-taking, discounting, work and leisure preferences, and also social preference, because it's all deeply rooted in utility theory. We had this discussion yesterday about Big Five. I think John made a good point, at least I totally agree with that. In terms of how good a prediction is, it's not just how much we can explain in terms of R squared, but how conceptually deep developed these notions are, right? And Big Five comes from an ex-ante procedure of, what we probably care about in looking into language, for example. Economic preference come from a totally different angle. They start out from a utility maximizing kind of paradigm, but both of these notions are deeply rooted in some conceptual framework, at least, right? And therefore, I'm willing to give up some of the explanatory power, but know what I'm talking about, rather than just having an ad hoc explanatory variable that, occasionally predicts a lot of stuff, but we don't really know what's going on. If non-cognitive skills are just the residual of anything but cognition, right, then it's a pretty amorph and unspecified notion, right? And it's important to show that it's relevant, but the next step really should be, what is it that is relevant? How can we make sense of it and conceptualize it in a deeper sense? But I wanted to talk about something completely different, which is actually two papers. I could probably skip this. So the first paper is on what we call a preference module. It's a tool, and I'm happy to talk about it here because several people indicated interest in measuring non-cognitive skills in a cheap and fast way. And the preference module is trying to exactly deliver a tool for assessing economic preferences. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute in a bit more detail. And we've taken this preference module and integrated it in the 2012 wave of Gallup World Poll to show how preferences are globally distributed, how they are correlated, if there's cultural patterns, what determinants are in terms of gender, age, etc. Correlation structures within country, between countries. We had a talk about vignettes yesterday. We find within and between country variation to be very similar in terms of correlation patterns. And some of the predictive power of these measures, both within country but also between countries, which I think is so far completely new territory. Okay. And as a byproduct, I'm hoping to convince you that this survey module that we've developed is actually useful in explaining behavior, but also shedding light of why we see what we see in the world. Okay, so theories of individual decision-making take as fundamental set of preference over risk, time, and social interactions. Why? Because most of our decisions involve either patience or risk-taking or social interaction. There are only very few actions, I would argue, that are not, at least in part, determined by risk, time, or social preferences. In fact, there are primitives of choice theories beyond economics, in neuroscience, psychology, etc. There's some evidence, which I don't talk about here, that preferences are, that there's a substantial heterogeneity in these preferences, they often correlate with economic and social behaviors in the way theory predicts. In terms of how much they explain, that's an open issue, but in terms of explanatory power, they do equally well as Big Five, I would argue, roughly speaking. However, the evidence is generally scarce, scattered, and restricted to a limited set of countries, and typically based on non-representative samples. And one thing I want to highlight today is the subject pool you run your stuff on really, really, really matters, both be it representative versus student samples, convenience samples, but also the country where you elicit preferences. And some of the generalizations or conclusions that we've drawn from country-specific or subject pool-specific studies do not generalize if we look into large-scale representative samples across the globe. Okay? So what we do is we measure and analyze the global distribution of these preferences, and we are using two tools, and this is two things to remember from my talk. The first is the preference module, and the second, using this preference module, this globally representative data set on 80,000 subjects in 76 countries. Okay? What we do, to just highlight what the main findings I'm talking about today, this is only the tip of the iceberg of what we're planning to do and hope to do. And by the way, if anybody wants to team up, just let me know. The data is there. We identify strong heterogeneity across countries, and think about it for a second. Ex ante is not clear that, I mean, we know there's heterogeneity within country, but would we expect there's between country heterogeneity? It's not clear. Raising new questions, for example, where's this heterogeneity coming from? I'll give you two examples. If you look into ancient migration pathways, 50,000 years back, you can proxy this with language trees or genetic information. You can explain a huge part of the between-country variation risk-taking as of today. That's one paper we've done. In the current project, we look into aversive conditions in terms of weather anomalies over the last 1,500 years. And if you think about how you should respond or optimally adapt to it, you should develop a taste for patience, because if weather conditions are unpredictable, you're a better patient. Otherwise, you're gone. And in fact, there's a strong correlation between the level of patience between countries and weather anomalies over the last 1,500 years. So just highlight or indicate at the country level where these preferences are coming from. Second, we show that preferences are related to individual characteristics such as age, gender, and cognitive ability. One of the things I want to highlight, though, is that while some of these relations are kind of universal, there's substantial variation between countries, which in itself is interesting, but also potentially informative for understanding things like gender wage gaps, for example. Right? I'm going to show you some figures on that. And then, this is only for you, Jim. Around the world, preference measure predictive of a wide range of individual level behaviors. Right? And depending on time, I'm going to show you in particular stuff we've done on wealth and GDP and growth and its relation to patients, both between countries, within region, but also within individual. Okay? Yeah? I only take questions from economists.
Or their co-authors.
It was a joke, so.
What is globally represented?
I will talk about that in a second. Okay, that's the plan. That's what global means here. So we're talking about a representative sample in 76 countries. It's representative in the sense that it's representing 90% of the world population and global income, and it's deliberately constructed to have as large as possible geographic and cultural heterogeneity. So in terms of religious background, geographic location, etc., etc. All the details can be found in the paper. I don't have the time to explicitly talk about, but as a rough number, it's representative for 90% of the world population and income. These are our survey measures on risk-taking, patients, reciprocity, positive, negative, altruism, and trust. Trust is not a preference, it's a belief, but we include it in anyways. Okay, so what do we do? In the end, we have a 12-item preference module. There's also a longer version. If you have more time, you can use that. For the 12-minute version, you approximately need 8 minutes in a CATI or CAPI type of interview. Okay? And this is not an ad hoc measure, but it was selected through a rigorous ex-ante experimental validation procedure. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this in slightly more detail on the next slide. To be a bit more specific, what we had is subject participated in standard incentivized experiments that are designed to elicit preferences. Okay. 2 weeks, 2 weeks later, subjects answered a large battery of survey questions designed to measure preferences. Okay. So there's some time in between. It was typically a set of 30 to 40 survey items that we either made up ourselves or took from existing literature. Okay. Elke Weber from Columbia, for example, has worked on risk preferences quite a lot. We included all of her questions on risk-taking, for example. We included stuff of the NLSY, the GSERP, etc., etc. For some of these preferences, there weren't very good candidates to select from previous literature, and then we constructed our own survey instruments. And then we had a simple selection procedure, which is take behavior in an incentivized paid lab experiment as the true revelation of your preference, which is completely debatable, but for the sake of the argument, let's accept that. That's your behavior under highly controlled, tightly controlled, incentivized conditions, and then take those survey items that jointly perform best in explaining this observed behavior. Okay? And that's the selection criterion. And with this selection, we had a final set of 12 items, which I'm going to show you in a second. These items were then translated back and forth by professionals. The monetary values, some of the questions will involve quantitative decisions, which means that you have to kind of adjust these monetary values to the specific country. So they were all normalized along the median household income across country, and it was pre-tested in 22 countries of various cultural heritage. Okay, that was interesting because we had to actually, change 2 words. In Muslim countries, the term lottery, for example, is we cannot use it for various reasons. So we had to change that term, and there was another term. Other than that, it was pretty much like the original survey. Okay. So one paper is the preference module. I'm not talking about this here. This is explaining if you want to use the survey, you can send me an email. I have 2 or 3 copies where we describe, but it's 90 pages with all appendices, etc. So there's only 5 copies. If you're interested in using it, you find all the details in this paper. In a sense, what we try to do, and I think this is relevant for the topic of this conference, we leverage the strength of the experimental and survey approaches, right? Both have their pros and cons, and the ultimate idea was, can we have a experimentally validated, in a sense, behaviorally relevant, at least what we hope is behaviorally relevant, but that is short and cheap in the sense of being able to be implemented in large international survey studies. Okay, and it actually takes 8 minutes. Okay. There are some methodological aspects that are maybe worth being highlighted. For example, when we did the experiments to, validate these survey items, subjects typically took 2 experiments or 3 experiments to reduce measurement error to have a more precise estimate of their true behavior. Experiments and surveys were some time apart to, avoid consistency biases, etc., etc. It was, reversed order, etc., etc. There are many more details. Okay. So for risk preference, in the experimental validation, subjects completely financially incentivized multiple price lists, which means you go through a list and at some point you change between a safe and a risky option, which indicates the point of indifference and implicitly reveals your risk, your willingness to take risk. And then we had these 30 to 40 survey questions, and these 2 were selected by our statistical selection process. One is a qualitative item. It asks for the respondent's self-assessment of his or her willingness to take risk on an 11-point scale. Coincidentally, this is the question that we've been using in various papers in the past. It's the question that comes from the GSERP. Okay, and we tied our hands. It's not that we wanted it. I mean, I was happy to see that it is actually one of the best predictors, but this is the outcome of a validation procedure rather than an ex-ante decision. The second item is a quantitative item, and it's using a staircase procedure. It consists of 5 interdependent hypothetical binary choices between a fixed order and varying safe payments. Here's an example. So suppose you are asked the question, what do you prefer, 100 euros for sure or 50 chance of receiving 160 or nothing? Okay? And then you say, look, I prefer 100 or I prefer the lottery. And depending on that question, the next question progressively narrows the bounds, and you get closer and closer to a point of indifference, right? It sounds like a complicated procedure, but in fact it's not, right? You just have to make sure that the interviewer understands what the next question is depending on a specific answer. Okay? Let me skip these details. This is from the interviewer. This is a picture from a woman in Bangladesh. This is the interviewer. This is the participant here. This is from Cambodia. Many more pictures. Okay, most of the interviews were actually copied, so they were in person. Why? Because telephone coverage is not granted. In those countries where the telephone coverage was more than 80%, it was a telephone interview. Okay, this is these are the 12 items I'm going to talk about. So we have 2 measures for patients, 2 for risk-taking. One is a quantitative measure, and it's using a staircase procedure, as I exemplified for risk-taking. It's very similar for intertemporal choice. And then a subjective willingness to wait as a subjective question, akin to the willingness to take risk in general for risk-taking. And generally, we have a mixture of a quantitative and a qualitative question. And then we produce, you can use them or not, depending on your preference, weights that come from the validation procedure, right? So these actually reflect the predictive power of these 2 items in the validation exercise. You can use them or ignore them. You can also do equal weight, right? But we are using these weights because I think if you take the whole approach seriously, you should actually take these weights and not just arbitrarily 50-50. Just one second. So most contain a quantitative and a qualitative item, which I think from an international perspective is also quite interesting. Why? Because the quantitative question really fixes the context and everything. So stakes, probabilities, etc. are fixed, and there's little scope for culturally specific interpretations. Right? While the subjective question is more amenable or open for specific idiosyncratic cultural interpretation. Of course, you could always go back and just use the quantitative question. You could also, if you're interested, look into the differences between country if you use the quantitative versus the qualitative measure to actually find out something about perceptions of differences between countries and cultures, etc. For what I'm doing now is we take all 12 items, construct the weight these, and then standardize by the world mean. So everything I'm going to show you now in terms of figures is the world representative agent has a mean 0 and standard deviation of 1. Okay, it's all in standardized variables. Sure.
I'm just going to nitpick a little bit. So just you have this patient's experiment, obviously. So how will the subjects promise to get what they actually?
Oh, we took care. It's a state-of-the-art experiment. It's the best you can get.
I'm sure you did that. What about the order? So did they get only one of these things?
No.
Only accumulate?
Look, they took part, say, today you're taking part in 3 intertemporal decision experiments, and you know nothing about service or anything. The only thing you know is you've been signed up to show up in the lab 2 weeks later. And then you get a sequence of 40 questions concerning willingness to wait or patience, etc., etc. And you fill out, these 40 survey questions. And likewise for the other preferences.
So at the same time or later? The risk and time and risk possibility?
The experiment and the survey is always at least 1 week apart.
Okay.
For each preference.
And they're all paid? You didn't pick
The
one?
experiments are all paid.
So then you switched the orders then?
We switched orders. We tried to. It's about 450. It's about 450 subjects. I mean, that's essentially another paper, and all the details, as I said, can be found in this paper. Okay.
Maybe this is minor.
It is minor.
Okay. This is about a fact, and the others are
No, look, trust. Let's ignore trust. It is minor. Yeah, no. I was going back and forth. Should we not include it? What's nice is if you correlate our trust measure, which also was coming out of a procedure, you will also notice we spent only one question on it. We might have spent 2 or 3, but I thought, this has been done so often in various countries. What's nice though is our measure is highly correlated with, World Value Survey, trust measures, etc. Okay. Now I'm setting up this website right now. It's 95% done, maybe 94, so you may or may not want to remember globalpreferences.org, where you can go and then select the country of interest and then download the preference module in the language you're interested in. So if you're interested in time preferences in Russia, for example, you download the Russian version. The United States is English or Spanish. It's way more than 100 languages. Why? Because in some countries, as you all know, which I did not, take the Philippines, for example, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 official languages, right? And you will find on this website, you will find the original version in these different languages for more than 100 languages, okay? And all the resources, how we did it and what we've done, etc., will be available on this website. At this point, the data will not be available on this website, but at some point it will. Question? No. Okay. So let me start off by showing you some descriptives. This is a world map of patients. Darker blue means more patient, darker red means more inpatient. White indicates the world average mean, okay, which is normalized to be 0. I have, 30 figures or something, and I'm not intending to talk about this in detail here. I just want to make you familiar with this stuff. If you're interested in the paper where we explain, various things in more detail, I'm happy to send it. Let me just spend 2 seconds on this. You find a sharp difference between South and North America, for example. You'll find that some of the richer countries are more patient. So it's the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Australia. You also see that there's quite some heterogeneity across the globe, okay? Which, as I said before, wasn't clear, right? Even if you have substantial within-country variation, why on earth should countries be different, right? So we should start thinking about preference endowments not just as be relevant for the individual, but also at the country level. And of course, the ultimate test is that variation meaningful for things that we care about? And this is what I'm going to show you in the end. Okay. This is for risk-taking. The US is fairly willing to take risks, so it's blue.
How does that correlate with interest rates?
I shouldn't.
No, I mean, if you think
it's positive. It is positively correlated, which is interesting because both risk-taking and patience are kind of good preferences for economic outcomes. We know that. And it happens that we observe a strong co-evolution of preferences apparently, which I think is a quite fascinating issue to delve in deeper. And we have no theoretical guidance at this point to inform us why we should see a co-evolution of preferences within a country.